In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus knew the world was round, so he looked for the east as he was westward bound. Christopher Columbus was looking for a shorter route to India and the Orient than having to sail down the west coast of Africa and around the Cape. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas and went on to discover the Americas. And thus began European colonialization of North America. In 1670, the British government granted the Hudson Bay Company the exclusive rights to the fur trade in the watershed of Hudson Bay, a right they retained for almost 200 years. The Hudson Bay Company called the land Rupert's Land, after Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who was a nephew of King Charles I of Britain and the first governor of the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company was not interested in bringing in settlers. Instead, they built their fur trading posts on the shores of Hudson Bay, the most important of which was York Factory, and had the Aboriginals bring the pelts to them, traveling downriver by canoe. In days gone by, the rivers were the transportation routes of the continent. The trade was mainly in beaver pelts, which the British and other Europeans used to make felt hats, the fashion of the day. As the beaver were depleted, the company began to explore further west, eventually crossing the mountains of British Columbia and establishing trading posts as far south as Fort Vancouver at the mouth of the Columbia River near present-day Portland, Oregon. Travel to and from the Pacific West Coast was for the most part through the Yellowhead Pass in the Rocky Mountains. By 1775, all of North America east of the Mississippi River and to the north was controlled by Great Britain. Most of the population of European descent was east of the Appalachian Mountains. The southern 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast had about 2.5 million inhabitants. West of the Appalachian Mountains was still sparsely populated. The colonies to the north, along the Atlantic coast and the St. Lawrence River, had about 150,000 inhabitants. When the American Revolutionary War for Independence broke out, in the southern 13 colonies, the northern colonies were invited to join, but declined, preferring to remain loyal to the British. At the end of the war, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 granted the 13 colonies their independence. Britain relinquished the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to the Americans. Spain was given control of Florida. Britain preferred to retain instead islands in the Caribbean with their lucrative sugar plantations, rather than retain an area that was sparsely populated and expensive to govern. The border between the British colonies and the United States was to pass through the Great Lakes and westward following the rivers to as far as Lake of the Woods. New Orleans, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, became an important commercial route for trade from the Mississippi River Valley, and it changed hands several times. The French controlled it from 1682 until 1763, when part of it was ceded to Spain. In 1800, it was given back to the French. Then in 1803, it was sold to the Americans. The boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase, as it was known, were disputed, the Americans claiming it included all of the western half of the Mississippi River Basin, the western boundary being the continental divide of the Rocky Mountains. In 1819, the Adam-Onis Treaty defined more precisely the boundary between the USA and New Spain, later known as Mexico. The northern boundary was established as the 42nd parallel. Trade embargoes imposed on the Americans as a result of the French Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars incited the Americans in 1812 to attack the British colonies to the north. The War of 1812, as it came to be known, ended in a stalemate. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 reaffirmed the existing border. That is, the border ran through the Great Lakes and extended as far west as Lake of the Woods. A further agreement in 1818 extended the border from the Lake of the Woods along the 49th parallel to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, adjusting the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. But the War of 1812 left a lasting fear that American expansionism would again attempt to annex the British territories to the north. In 1812, Lord Selkirk arrived at the junction of the Red and Assiniboia rivers and established the Selkirk Colony, the first colony of Europeans to settle the Great Plains north of the 49th parallel. The only problem was that the area was already inhabited by the Métis, people of mixed race, resulting from intermarriage of the European fur traders with the Aboriginal population. With the decline in the beaver fur trade, the Métis had turned to hunting the large buffalo herds that roamed the Great Plains. They dried and pulverized the meat, mixed it with tallow and wild berries, and sold the product, pemmican, to the fur traders, who were trapping and transporting farther west. Pemmican was an ideal food for the trail and trap lines. Nutritious, compact, and preserved well. The bison hides were shipped east to make drive belts for industrial machinery. By the 1840s, bison had replaced the beaver as the most important fur for trading. At the time Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, it is estimated that as many as 60 million bison roamed the Great Plains of North America. By 1884, there were only 325 left in the United States and 200 north of the 49th parallel. Mass destruction of the bison began in the 1830s with the arrival of settlers and fencing and cropping of the land. The buffalo were not compatible with farming, as they trampled both fences and crops. Millions were killed over a short period of time, some simply for sport. When railroads came to the Great Plains in the United States, and the bison blocked the track, passengers climbed on top of the rail cars and shot at the bison with repeating rifles. On the northern plains, the Métis were left with no leather for clothing, no bones for tools, no hair for rope, and nothing to eat, this causing widespread starvation. Expansion westward began after the War of 1812, then accelerated in the 1830s. In the United States, wagon trains of settlers began traveling over the Oregon Trail from present-day Independence on the Missouri River to the present-day states of Oregon and Washington, which at the time were known as the Oregon Territory. Fort Vancouver was still the Hudson Bay Company's main trading post on the West Coast, and ownership of the Oregon Territory was thus in dispute between the Hudson's Bay Company, the British government, and the United States. This was settled in 1849 with the extension of the Canadian-United States border along the 49th parallel from the Rocky Mountains to the Strait of Georgia. Vancouver Island ended up wholly within British territory. The Hudson's Bay Company abandoned Fort Vancouver and set out their operations at Fort Victoria on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. At about the same time, the end of the Mexican-American War re-established the southern border of America to approximately its present location. Exploration of the west coast of North America by sea began in 1776, when the infamous Captain Cook sailed up the coast searching in vain for a northwest passage, that is, a passage by sea from Europe to the Orient, north of North America. In 1791, the British Royal Navy Captain George Vancouver explored and charted North America's northwest Pacific coast regions, including circumventing Vancouver Island. But colonization was slow. By 1849, when Fort Victoria, later to become the city of Victoria, was made a British Crown colony, it had a population of only 774. Then, in 1858, gold was discovered in the interior of British Columbia, and the Caribou Gold Rush was on. Fort Victoria grew, as it became the jumping-off point for the journey up the Fraser River to the gold fields. The gold rush led to the establishment of Bakerville in the interior, in a region the Hudson Bay Company referred to as New Caledonia. With the influx of gold miners, Bakerville reached a population of approximately 10,000. making it the largest community in North America, west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. In 1866, Fort Victoria was united with New Caledonia to become a single colony, the colony of British Columbia. A year later, in 1867, 4 of the British North American colonies in the East, that is, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, united to form the country we now call Canada. Also in 1867, the United States bought Alaska from Russia. The influx of American settlers from the east over the Oregon Trail had contributed in 1849 to the loss of the states of Washington and Oregon, and the extension of the border between British North America and the United States along the 49th parallel, from the Rocky Mountains to the Strait of Georgia. Now sandwiched between the Americans, to both the south and the north, the colony of British Columbia became increasingly concerned that the United States might attempt to annex them. The Canadian government also had concerns that the United States would annex much of the West. Following the end of the American Civil War in 1865, there was a surge of migration of Americans westward. Several U.S. politicians were expressing interest in annexing all of the West Coast, that is, British Columbia, and indeed the northern Great Plains east of the Rocky Mountains, still under the Hudson Bay Company's jurisdiction. So in 1870, the newly formed country of Canada expanded by buying Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company and annexing the northern Great Plains, calling it the Northwest Territories. The border of the colony of British Columbia was extended north along the Rocky Mountains for a ways and then north to the 54th parallel. The Métis on the eastern Great Plains were surprised at the transfer of their homeland, believing that the Hudson's Bay Company did not possess the right to sell the territory without consultation or consent of the Aboriginals and the Métis. The Métis took action by rebelling against the government of Canada. The Red River Rebellion, as it was called, was settled by the government of Canada establishing the province of Manitoba, which was to be governed in the interests of both the Aboriginals and the Métis. In 1871, concerned that they would be annexed by the Americans, the colony of British Columbia asked and was admitted into the Confederation of Canada. As part of the agreement, a transcontinental railway was to be constructed, linking the colony of British Columbia to the eastern colonies. Construction was to begin within 2 years and be completed within 10 years. Railways were rapidly replacing the rivers as the transportation highways of the continent. Railway construction began in eastern North America in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The first transcontinental railway was completed in the United States in 1869, with the extension of an existing route from Chicago, Illinois to Omaha, Nebraska, west to Sacramento, California. In the years following Confederation, little was done towards the building of the Transcontinental Railway. In 1871, the government's chief civil engineer, Sanford Fleming, began surveying western North America for a route to the colony of British Columbia and the Pacific Ocean. He began his surveys from the Selkirk colony, which by this time had developed into the city of Winnipeg. In the end, he recommended crossing the Rocky Mountains via the Yellowhead Pass. This spurred real estate speculation in the northern Great Plains, where the railway was expected to run. In 1881, when the newly formed Canadian Pacific Railway Syndicate hired William Cornelius Van Horn as general manager to oversee construction of the Transcontinental Railway, a more southerly route was chosen. The contract between the Government of Canada and the Canadian Pacific Railway Syndicate gave the syndicate $25 million to build the railway, and 25 million acres of land to be chosen by the syndicate within 20 miles of the railway's right-of-way. The intent was to settle this land and thereby provide the railway with future income from the transportation of crops and commodities. The land to the south had not been as extensively settled, giving the syndicate unimpeded land selection. But more importantly, to the decision to locate the railway further south was the fear of American encroachment north of the 49th parallel. Construction of the railway was to begin with work on 4 sections, 3 of which were under Van Horn's management. As the government insisted on the route being an all-Canadian route, construction of one section was north of Lake Superior, from Calendar, the end of track in eastern Canada, to Fort William at the western end of Lake Superior. This section was to almost bankrupt the syndicate, as it consisted of granite rock of the Canadian Shield, a ring of low mountains surrounding Hudson Bay, and of muskeg bogs. Granite is one of the hardest rocks in the world, and required large amounts of nitroglycerin and dynamite to level the track bed. Frozen muskeg bogs are almost bottomless pits, where, if not adequately filled, the track will simply sink into the bog. The second section under Van Horn's management was from Fort William to Winnipeg, which in 1860 had been connected by a railroad to the United States. This was convenient for importing men and supplies for railroad construction. The third section under Van Horn's management was across the Great Plains and through the mountains of British Columbia to meet up with the fourth section being built eastward up the Fraser River Canyon from the Pacific coast. This last section was being built by the Canadian government under the management of Andrew Onderdonk, an American engineer, and would be turned over to the syndicate when completed. In 1883, All sections of the railway were under construction. Construction across the Great Plains from Winnipeg proceeded rapidly. A record of 6.4 miles was laid in one day. By the fall of 1883, the track had been laid over 930 miles to the mountains of British Columbia and up the Bow River Valley to the approach to the Kicking Horse Pass. The Kicking Horse Pass was a more southerly pass than the Yellowhead Pass, which was known to exist in the Rocky Mountains. What wasn't known when it was decided in 1881 to take a more southerly route to the mountains was how the railway was to cross the next range of mountains in British Columbia, the Selkirk Range. Four mountain ranges stood in the path selected for the railway to cross British Columbia: the Rocky Mountains, the Purcell Mountains, the Selkirk Mountains, and the Gold Mountains. The 5,338-foot Kicking Horse Pass through the Rocky Mountains had been known to Europeans since 1858. Eagle Pass, at 1,804 feet in the Gold Mountains, also known as the Monashee Mountains, was discovered in 1865 by Walter Moberly, the Assistant Surveyor General of British Columbia. During the gold rush, Walter Moberly participated in the building of the Caribou Road up the Fraser River Valley to Bakersville. But his overriding interest was finding a route for the Transcontinental Railway. To him, the greatest obstacle seemed to be the impenetrable Gold Mountains. In 1865, he ascended the Eagle River, which flows westward from the Gold Range, and climbed to a peak where he had a view of the rugged area. He observed eagles flying directly into the seemingly unbroken wall of mountains, where they disappeared. A careful examination of the area fulfilled his hopes, and a pass was discovered. He named the pass Eagle Pass. Moberly went on to look for a pass in the Selkirk Mountains. He examined the Illecillewaet River, which flows westward from the Selkirk Range, but due to the onset of winter, was not able to complete his exploration. So in 1881, when the southerly route for the Transcontinental Railway was chosen, there was still no known pass in the Selkirk Mountains. The Canadian Pacific Railway Syndicate hired Major Albert Bowman Rogers, an experienced American surveyor, to search for the elusive pass through the Selkirk Mountains. Rogers was a small and wiry, fierce-looking man, known for frequent and furious bursts of profanity. He was often rude, insulting, denigrating, and belligerent, and his employees generally despised working under him. Hell's Bells Rogers, as they called him, cared not a whit about their safety, comfort, or food, or that of their horses. Major Rogers studied closely Moberly's survey notes and decided to have another look at the Illecillewaet River Valley. In 1881, he, along with his nephew Albert and 10 hired Aboriginals, began the trek up the Illecillewaet River Valley. They picked their way through mudflats, waded through beaver swamps, dense underbrush, and the vicious Devil's Club. Devil's Club grows 8 to 12 feet high. Large leaves, measuring as much as 12 inches across, are covered with sharp spines that tear flesh and clothing alike. Thus the name Devil's Club, or Devil's Cane. Reaching heights of 11,500 feet, the Selkirk Mountains strip copious amounts of water as the Pacific Ocean-laden clouds move eastward, making the eastern slopes of the Selkirk Mountains a temperate rainforest. The Selkirk Mountains receive more rain than many tropical rainforests. For 5 days, the party of 12 struggled ever upwards through a dense, damp forest and persistent patches of snow several feet deep. By the end of May, they came across a fork in the river, either stream potentially being the long-sought route to the elusive pass. Walter Moberly is said to have chosen the left branch that ended in a box canyon and no pass. Rogers chose the right branch. Traveling with 100-pound packs on their backs, soaked to the skin by rain and wet brush, wading through snow and ice water, they kept on, occasionally spying an enormous blue glacier peak through the dense forest. Eventually, they came to a height of land where Rogers observed snow melting away and the water running both west and east, indicating they had reached a pass. Rogers decided to ascend the south slope to get a better view. Once above the tree line, they found a ridge. 4 of the Aboriginals that had tied themselves together began crawling to the ledge above. But one slipped, dragging the other 3 off and plunging all 4 down the steep slope. Fear and shock and stunning silence gripped the remaining climbers. What would they do if the men were injured? How would they proceed in a forced march through the dense forest with no food, carrying injured companions? They descended until, to everyone's relief, they spied 4 moving specks far below. Leaving them for now, Rogers, Albert, and the 6 Aboriginals continued onward to the summit, arriving late in the evening, exhausted. Such a view, never to be forgotten. Our eyesight caroomed from one bold peak to another, for miles in all directions. The wind blew fiercely across the ridge, and scuddy clouds were whirling in the eddies behind the great towering peaks of bare rocks. Despite their exertion, they were unable to continue east of the pass. Rogers had not brought enough food, and they could go no further. The next spring, Rogers, his nephew, and 6 others ascended the Beaver River Valley, with the Purcell Mountains on their left and the eastern slopes of the Selkirk Mountains on their right. The trek was not easy. The forest was thick and overgrown, the view entirely blocked, and the travel slow and dangerous, barely 2 miles a day on some days. as they pushed through the undergrowth and Devil's Club. Once again, Rogers had packed too little food, and starvation loomed as a possibility should someone become injured or lost. They were forced to retreat and try again. High up in the Beaver River Valley, they turned to the right and traveled up Cascade Creek. Rogers arrived at the plateau he had seen the previous year and observed the peak he had ascended. He had found a pass through the Selkirk Mountains. Major Rogers had also been tasked by the syndicate with assessing the suitability for a railroad of the 3 known passes through the Rocky Mountains in southern British Columbia: the Howe Pass, the Kicking Horse Pass, and the Vermilion Pass. In July of 1881, Rogers undertook the task of examining the Kicking Horse Pass. He sent his nephew Albert to traverse the Kicking Horse Pass from west to east. When Albert failed to return at the agreed time, Rogers set out from his base camp in the Bow River Valley to search for him. He and his team ascended the Kicking Horse Pass from the east by a creek that flowed into the Bow River. At a point where they needed to cross the turbulent glacier stream, Rogers' assistant, Tom Wilson, suggested that they wait until morning, when the volume of water would have dropped due to the cooler temperatures and lower melt from the mountains at night. Major Rogers replied, "Afraid of it, are you? Want the old man to show you how to ford it?" And with that, he and his horse plunged into the icy waters. The water bowled the horse over in an instant, and Wilson was obliged to rescue the major from his bath in the stream. And so Bath Creek came to be named. Thereafter, whenever the stream suddenly flooded from heavy rains or glacier runoff from melting snow, surveyors and railway workers were said to have sarcastically remarked, "The old man has taken another bath."